The DarkHorse Podcast has got into trouble, and we're going to talk about what happened. We're going to talk about what happened to Bret Weinstein and Heather Heying, but we're going to talk about it from the biggest perspective possible. We're not going to engage in culture wars, and we're not going to engage in any scientific conversation. Rather, we're going to start with two really important facts. One is that the public squares of our democracies are in good part either unregulated or regulated by Silicon Valley companies who regulate them erratically, irrationally, irresponsibly, untransparently, without recourse to appeal, and have no more legitimacy to engage in this regulation than a potato chip company, or than my kebab shop down the road, or than my local bakery 1 kilometer this way in East London, or my tea supplier. I mean, Jack Dorsey has no more legitimacy to tell you what you can or can't say in the public square of your democracy than my neighbor Mike. I mean, imagine if my neighbor Mike just called you up and said, look, unfortunately, these 11 things are things you can't say. Well, who the hell are you? Well, I'm a computer programmer, and I'm an app builder. I'm Australian. I live in East London. I decided I could tell you what to do. It's bizarre because you need an authority that has legitimacy to tell you these things. And that's where our focus needs to go when controversies about content online occur, as opposed to debating what a potato chip company should or shouldn't do. Instead of that, we should look at why we have a potato chip company in place in that situation. So that's the first fact. The second fact that we're going to bear in mind is that today, Western democracies are coming out of the bay and going out into open ocean, where they're not going to sink, because democracies can coexist with crisis.
Crisis isn't necessarily antithetical to democracy. It just ain't true that democracy proceeds with conflicts that stop short of the kind of conflicts that put the democracy itself into question. That kind of existential crisis for democracy is always on the cards. It's always something that can be there around the corner. And it looms a little bit more for us now than it did 10, 20 years ago.
Democracies have robustness. The firmest democracies in the world have so much institutional resilience that they could survive 2 or 3 terms of a Trump. But nevertheless, democracies are going out there into open ocean, into bumpier and more volatile waters. And we need to consider that that's the reality we're looking at, that the current wobbles we're facing aren't an aberration, they are a small illustration of bigger things to come. And that one of the causes of us being pushed out into the ocean is that we can't regulate our public squares properly and haven't figured out how to do that. But let me make a second sea or ocean analogy. And I'm going to take this one from Joe Rogan, who got into trouble for something a few months ago. It doesn't matter if he justly got into trouble for it. The point is what he said in response. He said, look, I'm a guy who has broken out there into open water. And he just said that in a sentence, but what he really meant was you might have some kind of a beach with a net where things are regulated, but some people who develop a big following can just break out of that and swim in a territory where they're unregulated. Nobody regulates Joe Rogan and nobody can really cancel him. He's too big for that. And so he says, look, I broke out and now I'm here. What do you expect from me? So the implication is, look, I'm really good at understanding combat. I am really good at understanding quite a few things, but I'm a smart guy who's just like a human-sized thumb, and I'm not an expert at anything in particular. I don't know much about politics. What do you expect from me? Of course I'm going to get things wrong. Bring in another image. Imagine that we suspended all rules inside supermarkets, such that no laws applied inside the supermarkets. And imagine what would happen. Well, it's clear what would happen. Pandemonium. But then imagine that when the pandemonium happened, instead of discussing the fact that we have no clear rules in the supermarket, we started debating why somebody took one box of chocolates as opposed to two, or two boxes of chocolates as opposed to none, and freaked out about what terrible behavior this was, and why on earth, let's say, Bret and Heather Weinstein took two boxes of chocolate, when in fact they were operating in an unregulated space, except for a little bit of regulation from the kebab shop owner next door, who would sometimes come in and arbitrarily ban things without explaining why, without giving any recourse to appeal, except a kind of untransparent appeal back to the kebab shop guy, which wouldn't help anybody and would just make everybody lose trust in how our public squares function all round. So we've got public squares that have no way of being legitimately filtered and controlled. And then we've got democratic decline. Our democracy is going downhill. And big part of our democracy is going downhill is the lack of proper regulation or proper legitimate oversight of our public squares. And as part of the democratic decline, what people feel is not just a sense of wanting to just give up on their political institutions because they don't seem to be doing them any good or helping them. It's worse than this. People want to give up on their political institutions because they feel opaque to them. In other words, it feels to them that they're looking at a sports game where 4 or 5 sports have been mixed together and it's not clear what the rules are. And this stuff doesn't make sense, even though it's supposed to represent your interest. And you just want to throw snowballs or eggs at it and give up on it. In a situation like that, this synergy of multi-causal democratic decline and unregulated or poorly and illegitimately regulated public squares is a disaster. And what Joe Rogan's image for me means is that even when somebody has caused a great deal of harm by an irresponsible act, the thing to talk about is still how we run our public squares rather than over-focusing on what they did, because this is bizarre either way, because if somebody didn't do anything irresponsible, was profoundly responsible in their conduct online with their big audience, that too is deeply disturbing. Why is it deeply disturbing? Because what they are doing is purely dependent on which side of the bed they woke up on, you know? And so what's really worrying about the most responsible content providers online is that they could just wake up the next day and stop being responsible. We have no way of handling this except this sort of obscure, erratic, weird, untransparent, trust diminishing kind of bit of intervention that comes from the potato chip companies. So this is a real problem. So now, against this background and with these particular concerns in mind, let's look a little bit at Bret Weinstein and Heather Heying and the DarkHorse Podcast. Now, a lot of people online are bad actors, like really bad actors. They are either lying and manipulating deliberately, or they are intentionally or unintentionally sort of intellectual entrepreneurs or political entrepreneurs. They ride the waves of silos of culture war opinion for their enrichment at the level of cash or at the level of views. Bret and Heather, in my opinion, and this is my strong emotional intelligence read, aren't like that at all. They're really well meant. They're well intentioned. Nor is there any sense in which they're being driven by ego. I mean, if anything, Bret is got a very mild form of imposter syndrome. Bret is a little bit insecure about having this audience, even though it's been hard and there have been lots of challenges. But Bret's a little bit insecure about suddenly having this big audience, and he's trying to do his best with it. So there is no sense of crude manipulation. There's no sense of any kind of deliberate lying or twisting of facts, nor is there any evidence of some kind of an ego trip. Now, that doesn't mean that something hasn't come out that's grossly factually irresponsible. That's a separate question. We'll come to that shortly. But the intent is actually sound. Now, in case you don't know who these people are, it doesn't really matter, because for the purpose of our conversation, they could be, just another example of an online, content platform, an online show, an online podcast. Well, let's give a little bit of history about where these folks have come from. Bret and Heather were forced out of an institution called Evergreen that basically went collectively nuts. And there are some human stories that are really clear, where there's one side that's in the right and the other side that's in the wrong. This is one such story. They got evicted out of an institution that just went completely nuts. And the nuttiness they experienced there was a pre-echo of a lot of the nuttiness one sometimes sees in the excesses of hyper-liberal identity politics that sometimes drives some, but not all, of the social justice projects in our cultures. So then they went independent. They started the DarkHorse Podcast eventually. And during the course of the pandemic, they were involved in arguably a very constructive way with some of the issues around the pandemic. I mean, I remember early on, they were clear about the importance of masks. And this was at a time when institutions, including public health institutions, were sending out, to put it mildly, very unhelpful messages about masks. And moreover, Bret was very clear that homemade masks worked. You didn't need to have an N99 or nothing. Then it seems to me that Bret and Heather were clear and constructive around helping the public understand the difference between aerosol and droplet transmission. And this is painful stuff when good work like that's done. And it's painful stuff because really this work should be done very, very well by the government and by the public health institutions. And sometimes when that's not happening, and it's certainly not been happening here in the UK, that's actually had worse communication than the US authorities. So these are problems that are very difficult because we have got institutions that are not working entirely well, to put it mildly, and that need to be compensated for by people who are operating in a public square that is unregulated or arbitrarily and weirdly regulated by illegitimate and unaccountable bodies. I think that there were quite a few other helpful interventions from Bret and Heather, and there was a recent intervention about a particular medication that we don't need to mention or discuss. But even if one rejects some of the claims that were made about that particular medication by Bret and Heather, nevertheless, I'm happy to point to the UK medical educator, Dr. John Campbell, who has come out and very clearly said that at least what we want is for the UK government or the government in your country, wherever you are, to come out and state what their position is on this medication. And their position can be whatever it is, but damn it, at least state where you stand on it. But the issue that the DarkHorse podcast really got into trouble with is the issue of how the vaccine works, particularly how the mRNA vaccines work. And again, my particular view about how this was handled is unimportant because we're looking at this big picture. And so the particular people involved, the particular issue involved is less important than the general conversation about how the public squares work. But bear with me because I do need to put a little bit of foundation about where I'm coming from here. I think that if anybody watched the main podcast with Bret, where he had Robert Malone on, who is quote unquote one of the folks involved in the creation of mRNA vaccine technology. We're just going to leave this in quote marks and not take it further. And then there was this other guy there who looked as suspicious as anything, and he was a serial entrepreneur who was doing all kinds of write-ups about vaccine statistics, vaccine efficacy, vaccine safety. That was a terrifying episode. It was a grossly irresponsible episode. And quite frankly, it's a failure of emotional intelligence, especially by Heather, to let this stuff come out. Because even if the claims in there were claims that a reasonable person should trust, and that's not the case, the style of the delivery, the spirit of that episode would have made anybody reasonable absolutely terrified. This was grotesquely irresponsible communication. And then, of course, comes the fact that leading virologists would not recognize some of the things that were asserted. But we can just leave that conversation rolling, except for maybe this footnote. There's a difference between communicating in public science and debating science in public. I just don't believe in debating science in public at all. Science happens in a very coercive, non-public, publicly transparent, but non-public in the sense of not there for the engagement of the general public kind of process, which leads, I'm sorry about this flickering thing, it's a present to my YouTube channel by a friend. The scientific process is a special kind of institutional process that's complex, that's coercive, and it's not about the public debating this sort of stuff. Now, take somebody like the climate scientist Kate Marvel, and she says, look, I'm a climate science communicator, but I don't engage in debate about the science, even though I do the science. I don't engage in debate about the science in public. Because if we're trying to figure out how clouds work, we don't want a physicist specializing in that debating in public Dave 77799 in public. We don't even want two physicists who specialize in how clouds work debating that in public, because the person who loses the debate will often be perceived as somebody who's won the debate by the general public. And so there's a real problem about debate about how the vaccine works in public. What we should have is a conversation about where the latest scientific consensus is, what might be wrong with it. It can certainly be questioned, but not explicitly debated, because this leads to a real problem, even if the two people debating it are scientists properly qualified. But I don't regard, on the basis of my own experience talking to virologists, I've had a very serious health condition. For several years I couldn't walk, couldn't talk, couldn't read, couldn't think. Eventually over many years I got better. But in the course of this I've spoken to many leading immunologists and virologists. And then over and above that, my background is in professional philosophy. My PhD is in political philosophy. And so I, in part, in virtue of being a philosopher, specialize in the question of who is qualified to say what, how, and when. Because a philosopher, as long as they're not talking about science, is never speaking of duty. And in my view, Bret and Heather are qualified to talk in general about what function vaccines serve, in general how they work, but to talk in particular about how a particular vaccine works, well, they're more qualified than me, they're more qualified than a carpenter, but they're not as qualified as a leading virologist would be, for example. And so there is a problem there straight away. Now, here's where we really get to the heart of this conversation. I want to emphasize Joe Rogan's point that there is an open ocean out there and that people are just thrust into it. And that's what happened to Bret and Heather too. And I think we've got to be clear that our attention has to go, and our anger and concern and whatever else we feel has to go to the nature of this space that Heather and Bret have been thrown out into, rather than to how they, in this particular instance, arguably behaved irresponsibly while their intentions remain sound. This is where we have to look at. Because whatever YouTube did with Bret and Heather, YouTube did wrong. Because YouTube is not legitimately placed to arbitrate how Bret and Heather conduct themselves in the public sphere. somebody with as big an audience as them still couldn't get proper recourse. They couldn't appeal to YouTube in a transparent way. And moreover, when they appealed to YouTube. They appealed to the potato chip company about the potato chip company's bad behavior. This is very, very, very strange. When we suspend all laws inside supermarkets, we shouldn't debate who has stolen how many chocolate bars or didn't steal any chocolate bars. We should debate why we suspended the rules there. And why, insofar as we haven't suspended the rules, we've got some rules being applied erratically by the kebab shop owner next door. And when the kebab shop owner next door applies their rules, they are applied without recourse, except some kind of untransparent appeal back to the kebab shop owner. This is a real problem, and this is where we always have to go, which is why the current debate, well, yes, I love Bret and Heather, and I'm sure they got this right, versus they're grossly irresponsible. Unless we vaccinate the population maximally, we're going to be in real trouble. That's not where we need to go with this. Where we need to go with this is what the hell is happening with our public squares. Yeah. So what we've emphasized in the course of this conversation is basically two things. Our public squares are in trouble because they are improperly run and filtered and moderated, and they are undemocratic as it stands. And this is really bad in the context of democratic decline, in the context of citizens increasingly finding their political institutions not just questionable, not necessarily serving their interests, but actually opaque. This is the one thing. And the second thing, we've got this process of people being thrust out into open water. And because of that, my dispositional tendency is actually to be soft on people when that happens to them and focus on the big issue, even if they've happened to have done damage, because they did damage in the context of us suspending laws in the supermarkets. So let's fantasize here a little bit. Imagine that we do have a democratic internet, and imagine that YouTube is still YouTube, but there is an independent e-court system where Bret and Heather can appropriately apply and get a transparent and legitimate and politically impartial result. What would I have that institution do about this particular vaccine episode? Well, I'll go this in two ways. I'd be maximally soft on the general project and the general financial welfare of the DarkHorse podcast. In other words, I would try to hit the particular bit of content hard rather than the general enterprise. So I would not do anything, if I'm that e-court, to their podcast. But I might put a warning on that episode. I might make them offer a retraction. I might make them have 3 to 5 episodes with the world's leading virologists on there to recompensate for the potential misrepresentations that they shared in that particular episode. And that's how it proceeds. And there could be fines involved, but there would not be any systemic financial disrepair that they would be in as a result of this. That would be systemic. That really wouldn't happen. That is how I would balance it. But the way you might balance it could be different. And this is going to be different from country to country because countries have different cultures. But there may need to be some international principles about how this is done. How is that possible? How could you have differences, country to country, where Germany would favor quite a heavy-handed regulation of free speech? US Americans would want something much more liberal and free. And there could be some international principles how this was done. People are working on this. There are complex reports being written by people about what a democratic internet would look like, how we might move toward that destination. And this is what we need to talk about, not who behaved badly in the supermarket. This is really, really important that we snap out of this conversation. I listened to Sam Harris's podcast recently where he discussed the vaccine episode that Bret Weinstein did. And Sam said, well, I don't even know what YouTube should have done. And that's not actually an unfair thing to say, but what I'm saying is that the emphasis shouldn't be about what YouTube should do. The emphasis should be that Why is YouTube doing anything here at all to regulate something that is absolutely at the heart, at the core of our democracies? I invite you to tell me what you think about how you find yourself in the public squares of our society. What do you feel when you are on these platforms? Do you have a following on one of the platforms? Do you find that you self-censor? Are you afraid of something happening to you? Are you worried about the sources of power that control these public squares? Are you worried about what a democratic internet needs to be and how far we are from that destination? Thanks for watching and see you next time.